It happened on a Sunday afternoon in my parents' living room during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. The whole family was there. My parents, both grandmothers, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, my brother Keith, and scattered cousins. We just finished eating when Keith stood up from the couch and pointed directly at me. "You've torn this family apart," he said. His voice steady and measured like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in the mirror. "Everyone here knows what you've done. Everyone except you, apparently." My mother stopped clearing dishes. My father set down his water glass slowly. Neither of them looked at me. They both nodded at Keith like he was speaking scripture. I felt the room temperature drop. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice small. "Keith, I have no idea what you're saying." He shook his head sadly, like I'd just confirmed something terrible about myself. "That's exactly the problem. You don't even realize what you've done." He proceeded to outline accusations I'd never heard before. Things I supposedly said. Things I supposedly did. Moments I supposedly ruined. Every word landed like a hammer, and with every accusation, the family nodded. My aunt squeezed my arm with exaggerated sympathy. My cousin's eyes turned cold. Even my grandmother, who'd always been my quiet ally, suddenly looked at me with disappointment so deep I felt it in my chest. Nobody asked me to explain. Nobody asked if his story was true. They just accepted it because he said it with such careful sadness, like he was the one suffering from having to tell them. I realized in that moment that I didn't know my family at all. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Within hours, my aunt called my mother, just to check in. By the next morning, my cousins had stopped responding to my texts. The family group chat that had buzzed constantly suddenly went quiet whenever I tried to contribute. By day 3, Keith had woven additional details into his story. He told different relatives slightly different versions, each one tailored to their specific concerns. To my uncle who cared about family loyalty, Keith emphasized how I'd betrayed family secrets. To my grandmother who valued respect, he mentioned my disrespectful attitude. To my parents, he expressed deep sadness about my behavior, like he was grieving a version of me that never existed. I watched him at a family lunch 2 days later, telling his lies so smoothly that I could almost believe them myself. His voice was gentle, concerned. He sounded like a hero protecting everyone from a dangerous person. He even added pauses, strategic moments where he'd look down sadly like he was struggling with his emotions. That's when I caught my cousin Kayla flinch. Tiny movement. She'd been there during one of the incidents he was describing. She knew he was lying. I watched her catch my eye and immediately look away, guilt written across her face. Someone here knew the truth. But nobody was asking me for it anymore. The lie was easier to believe than the person being accused. And my brother had weaponized his sadness perfectly. He made it sound like love, like he was being forced by a sense of duty to tell them these awful things about me. Nobody wants to believe their brother is a liar. Nobody wants to believe they've been manipulated. By the end of that week, the lie had calcified into family gospel. That Friday night, my mother came into my room without knocking. She didn't sit on my bed. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed like she was a teacher confronting a student about a disciplinary matter. "Why did you embarrass us like that?" she demanded. "At the gathering, you could have defended yourself. You could have stood up and explained what actually happened. Instead, you just sat there like you were guilty of something." I was exhausted. I'd spent 4 days replaying the gathering in my mind, trying to understand how my own family had turned on me so quickly. "Because I don't know what I'm defending myself against," I said, keeping my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. "And you wouldn't believe an explanation anyway. You've already chosen to believe him. I could talk until I'm blue in the face and you'd still think I'm lying." Her face hardened instantly. "That's not fair," she snapped. "Neither is any of this," I replied. "Neither is being accused of things I didn't do. Neither is your own mother not asking for my side of the story before deciding I'm a terrible person." She expected me to fight, to cry and beg her to understand. To get angry so she could dismiss me as dramatic and emotional. Instead, I just looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside me shifted. I made a decision right then. I'm done explaining myself, I told her quietly. To you. To anyone. Keith. To aunts. Cousins. I'm done. She stared at me like I'd slapped her across the face. Then don't expect our support, she said coldly, and she left without closing the door. I heard her tell my father what I'd said. I heard them talking downstairs, disappointed and confused. Like I was the unreasonable one. Like wanting to be believed by your own family wasn't a basic human need. Like my refusal to perform guilt and defend myself against phantom accusations was selfish. I was completely alone now. And somehow that felt like the first honest moment I'd had in a week. Within 9 days, relatives stopped calling entirely. Invitations to Sunday dinners disappeared. My cousin didn't text back about our coffee plans like she'd promised. My uncle, who'd always been kind and who'd taught me to drive, started liking every single post Keith made but ignored mine completely. I learned through a friend of a friend that Keith had told people he was protecting the family from me. That he was the responsible one. The brave one for finally speaking up. He'd positioned himself as a reluctant hero, which made the lie even more powerful. People love supporting someone who's clearly suffering but doing the right thing anyway. Then I got a message. It was from a distant cousin I barely talked to, someone I'd seen maybe twice in my life. She'd forwarded a screenshot of something Keith had written in a private family chat. In it, he was explaining to relatives, in careful strategic detail, why he'd had to distance himself from me, why I was toxic, why the family needed to understand that loving me meant accepting my destructive behavior. There was no anger in it, no emotion, just cold, calculated positioning. I read it 3 times. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a heated moment that had spiraled. This was intentional. This was premeditated. My brother had planned this carefully, orchestrated it like a military campaign, and was executing it perfectly. He was building a case against me, and I was finally starting to understand why I was losing so completely. He'd prepared them before he ever accused me publicly. I spent the entire next day sitting in my room, not doing anything, just thinking. I started replaying moments from my entire life. Childhood. Elementary school when Keith broke my favorite toy and somehow convinced my parents it was an accident. Middle school when he told his friends something embarrassing about me and I had to deal with being laughed at for months. High school when he borrowed money from me and never paid it back, and my parents took his side when I asked for it back. How he was believed faster than me. Always. Every single time. How he was forgiven sooner. How my parents made excuses for him that they never made for me. How he learned early, probably from the time he was 8 or 9, that if he told a version of something first, everyone believed it. If he cried while telling it, they believed it even more. This wasn't new. This was just louder now. This was the final, public version of something that had been happening my entire life. I realized my silence wasn't weakness. It was clarity. For the first time in days, I could see the situation clearly instead of being blinded by panic and confusion. I wasn't losing my family because I wasn't explaining well enough. I was losing my family because they had never chosen me in the first place. They'd chosen him years ago. This was just the moment they were finally making it public. This was the moment they were finally honest about it. And my brother knew it would work because he'd practiced on them his whole life. I stopped feeling like a victim. I started feeling like someone who'd finally understood the game and realized I'd been playing by the wrong rules all along. Then I remembered something. Something specific. Something he forgot I knew about. It was small. Almost nothing. But it contradicted the entire foundation of what he'd been telling everyone. I got out of bed and opened my laptop. I went through my phone and laptop methodically. Text conversations with Keith. Emails he'd sent me. Family group chats. Screenshots I'd saved for no reason. Back when I was just a regular person in my family who didn't know I'd need evidence someday. Nothing dramatic initially. Just inconsistencies. Small cracks in his story. He said something happened in March. But I found a message from him in February talking about something completely different. He claimed I'd done X at a specific time, but I had clear proof I was somewhere else. A time-stamped photo, an email confirmation, a shared calendar entry. He said I'd said something cruel to his girlfriend at a family barbecue. But I had a text he'd sent me that same evening joking about how boring she was. It was like watching someone tell a beautiful story with all the right emotional beats, but the facts didn't fit together. The timeline was broken. The logic was fractured. One message in particular contradicted a key accusation he'd made. Not by much. Just enough that if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you'd notice the lie. I saved it to a folder. Then I found another one. And another. And another. I wasn't building a revenge plot. I was just documenting the truth. I didn't even know why I was doing it, except that I was tired. Tired of not knowing what was real. Tired of feeling crazy. Tired of wondering if maybe I was the problem. By the time I finished, I had 9 pieces of evidence. 9 different messages that proved my brother's timeline was broken. 9 different ways the truth contradicted his story. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet. But I felt less powerless. 3 days later, I ran into my Aunt Karen at the grocery store. She was the one who'd been at my cousin's birthday party. The same party my brother had twisted into a story about something I'd supposedly done there. She saw me and immediately looked uncomfortable. Like she wanted to avoid me but also wanted to say something important. "Hey," I said quietly. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Everything okay with you?" "Not really," I told her honestly. "I'm trying to understand something that happened at the party. When my brother said I..." She cut me off gently but firmly. "No one asked me what happened," she said, and then she hesitated. She looked around the store to make sure no one was listening. Waited. I didn't push. "I was there the whole time," she continued quietly. "I was there when he was talking about you. I know what actually happened. I know what he said wasn't true." My heart started beating faster. "Would you?" I started carefully. "Would you be willing to talk about it? To tell me what you saw?" She looked around again. She bit her lip. For a moment I thought she was going to say no. That she was too scared to go against my brother's version. Too worried about what the family would think. Too concerned about being pulled into the conflict. "Yeah," she said finally. "I will. But not here. Not now." She gave me her personal cell phone number and told me to text her when I was ready to talk. She said she'd been feeling guilty about staying silent, and she was tired of pretending she didn't know the truth. For the first time since this all started, since the moment my brother stood up at that gathering and pointed at me, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of me quietly gathering information. 2 weeks of me taking notes. 2 weeks of me understanding the full scope of what Keith had done. Then my brother decided to host a family dinner at his apartment. I found out about it through Instagram. He'd posted a photo of the setup with the caption, "Family First." He didn't invite me, obviously. But someone told me what happened at that dinner. He was comfortable now. Confident. The lie had settled into place like concrete, and nobody was questioning it anymore. The initial shock had worn off. The narrative had hardened. I was officially the problem. He made jokes about how sensitive I was. About how I couldn't handle normal family situations. About how I'd always been dramatic and self-centered. He talked about me like I was a difficult child, not a 30-year-old woman he'd known his entire life. Laughter followed every joke. Real genuine laughter. The family laughed at me like I wasn't even a person worth defending. Like I was a character in a story, not someone's sister. Not someone's daughter. My parents laughed too, according to my source. Like they'd already forgotten that they'd raised me. Like they'd already accepted that I was the villain of this story. Arrogance makes people careless. He wasn't worried about me anymore. He'd won. The family had chosen him, and as far as he knew, that was permanent. There was no threat left. No reason to be strategic anymore. He'd stopped watching his own words. He'd stopped being careful about consistency. He was just enjoying his victory. He thought it was over. He had no idea what was coming. I had coffee with my Aunt Karen 2 weeks later. She told me everything. She also told me something else that changed how I understood my situation. My parents weren't neutral in this. They were invested. Admitting Keith was lying would mean admitting they'd raised him to be manipulative. It would mean admitting they'd shown him favoritism his entire life. It would mean admitting they'd failed as parents. It would mean admitting they'd chosen their son over their daughter, and that choice had consequences. So they couldn't admit the truth. Instead, they repeated his version word for word. Like they'd memorized a script. Like they were protecting something more important than their own daughter. Like they were protecting their image of themselves as good parents. "Your mom said something to me that really scared me," Karen told me over coffee. She said, "We have to believe him. What else can we do?" Like the truth didn't matter. Like family loyalty meant ignoring what actually happened and accepting whatever story made things easiest. I understood then. Completely understood. They wouldn't protect the truth because protecting the truth would destroy the image of the family they wanted to have. It would make them question their parenting. It would make them feel guilty. It was easier to lose me than to admit they'd failed. That realization hurt more than the initial betrayal. I continued saying nothing. No explanations. No desperate texts to family members. No posts on social media trying to defend myself. No trying to convince people. Just silence. And the family filled that silence with their own assumptions. Keith grew more detailed in his lies. More dramatic. He added new stories. Elaborated on old ones. He was so comfortable now that he wasn't even being careful about consistency anymore. He was lazy with his fabrications. The more he talked, the more he contradicted himself. But the family didn't notice because they weren't listening with critical ears. They were just nodding, just accepting, just living in the story they'd agreed to believe. My silence had become a test of their loyalty, and they'd all failed it spectacularly. I printed everything out and mapped it on my bedroom wall. Places, witnesses, what Keith said happened versus what actually happened. The timeline was color-coded. The contradictions were highlighted. His story required me to be in 2 places at once during one incident. It required me to have done something after I'd already left for college during another. It required me to have knowledge of something that happened before I was even born, according to the math of his timeline. It was impossible. Mathematically impossible. Logically impossible. The more I looked at it, the more broken it became. The more I understood that this lie was fragile. It only worked because nobody was examining it closely. I realized something crucial. Keith had never expected to be questioned. He'd built his entire strategy on the assumption that I would panic and try to defend myself immediately. He'd never imagined I would stay silent and gather evidence instead. He'd never anticipated that someone would actually check his facts. I started keeping a notebook. Every time Keith said something new to a family member, I documented it. Every time his story changed slightly, even in small ways, I noted it. I recorded dates. I saved screenshots. I created a timeline on graph paper that showed exactly where his narrative fell apart. I realized this couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually something would crack. Someone would ask a question. Someone would check a date. Someone would do the math. The truth always comes out. Just takes time. And I had time. I had nothing but time. I was patient. I was methodical. I was building something that couldn't be disputed. My cousin Kayla reached out to me through a private message. She was the cousin whose eye I'd caught at that family dinner. The one who'd flinched when Keith was lying. "I've always felt something was off," the message said. "About what he's been saying about you. I never had proof. I just felt it in my bones. I know him. I know how he operates." She told me she'd found something. A message Keith had sent her months before the gathering. Months before he publicly turned everyone against me like flipping a switch. She sent me a screenshot. In the message, Keith was describing me to her almost exactly like he was describing me to everyone else now. Word for word. The same phrases. The same accusations. Like he was practicing the speech. Like he was workshopping a story before he released it to the family. The date on the message was from 6 months before the gathering. This was premeditation. He'd planned the entire thing. But Kayla also told me something else that shook me. She said Keith had done the same thing to her best friend 3 years ago. He'd orchestrated a situation where the friend's boyfriend turned against her, and she'd eventually cut herself off from their entire social circle. Kayla had watched it happen and hadn't connected the dots until now. She said she'd been kicking herself for not seeing the pattern sooner. She said she felt responsible for not speaking up when she could have. I told her it wasn't her fault. That manipulation is designed to make people doubt themselves. That silence from witnesses is how predators, and yes, that's what Keith was, continue their behavior unchecked. Kayla started keeping her own documentation after that. She reached out to other people Keith had allegedly wronged. Slowly, methodically, she gathered more evidence. She was building a case without me even asking her to. Keith decided he was tired of having me exist on the edges of the family. He decided to push for a complete cut. He pressured my parents to cut me off entirely. Not just distance, actual estrangement. For everyone's peace, he told them. She's disrupting the family. She's causing drama. The only way to move forward is if we all agree to distance ourselves. Completely. My parents considered it. Actually sat down and had a serious conversation about cutting their own daughter out of their lives. They discussed it between themselves, and then my mother told me that the family wanted distance. I wasn't asked how I felt. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't given a chance to respond. I was informed like I was a problem being managed. Like I was a situation they were handling. I wasn't asked. I was told. This was the moment I knew for sure. They would never choose me. They had already chosen. This was just the administration of that choice. And that realization changed everything about what I was willing to do next. A major family event was announced for 6 weeks away. A reunion. A celebration. Everyone would be there. And then I got an invitation. It was unexpected. My mother called me personally. "Your brother thinks it's time to clear the air," she said. "He wants to make things right. He thinks it's time for reconciliation." I knew exactly what that meant. He didn't want to make things right. He wanted to finish me off in front of everyone. He wanted a public victory. He wanted the moment where the entire family stood with him and rejected me completely. He wanted a spectacle. And he was arrogant enough to think he would win. He had no idea that I'd spent the last 5 weeks preparing. He had no idea about the evidence. He had no idea about Kayla coming forward. He had no idea that I'd been documenting everything. He had no idea what was waiting for him. But I also knew something else by this point. I knew that my family wouldn't come to my defense on their own. They wouldn't suddenly see the truth and stand with me. I wasn't going to this reunion to be saved or vindicated by people who'd already shown me their allegiance. I was going to this reunion for myself. To stand in the truth. To say it out loud in front of everyone. To stop carrying the burden of other people's lies. And if they didn't believe me, that would be their problem, not mine. My healing didn't depend on their acceptance anymore. That shift in perspective changed everything about how I planned to handle what was coming. The reunion was held at a resort 2 hours away from the city. A big family dinner the first night. Long tables. Fancy decorations. Everyone was there. All the relatives who'd chosen him. All the people who'd stopped calling me. Keith stood up to make a speech after dinner. He talked about forgiveness. About family healing. About moving forward. He said he'd been carrying pain, and he was ready to let it go for the sake of everyone. He expressed sadness about having to speak about me at all, but said it was necessary for the family's well-being. It was beautiful. It was moving. It was completely false. He subtly restated all the lies. His version of events. His timeline. His interpretation of my character. The room was already primed to see me as unstable, as the problem, as the person who'd caused all of this. He finished his speech with a plea for family unity. He sat down. People clapped. Some people looked sad. Some people looked at me with pity. Everyone was waiting to see how I'd respond. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I didn't do any of the things he'd prepared the family to expect from me. I just waited. I stood up slowly. The room went completely silent. I asked one simple question about the timing of one specific incident he'd mentioned in his speech. He answered with confidence. He gave a detailed response with specific dates. Then I asked him to hold on for a second. I pulled out my phone and read aloud a message. His words. His exact phrasing. His phone number on the message header. Timestamp clear as day. It said something completely different from what he'd just claimed in front of the entire family. Silence hit the room like a physical force. He laughed it off immediately. Too fast, like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life and this was his prepared response. But his laugh sounded nervous. Desperate. The room had heard the truth. And they knew it. Kayla stood up. She wasn't angry. She was professional. She was factual. She was exactly the opposite of what Keith had predicted. She confirmed my version of events. She talked about the specific incident. She said she'd been there the entire time, from beginning to end. I was present, she said calmly, her voice steady. What he's describing didn't happen. I can tell you exactly what actually happened because I was there. My parents looked confused for the first time in weeks. Like they were suddenly questioning everything they'd accepted as truth. Like the ground underneath their certainty had just shifted. But what really got the room's attention wasn't just what Kayla said. It was how she said it. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't angry at Keith. She was just stating facts like a witness giving a deposition. She had dates. She had details. She had a clear, consistent timeline that matched mine perfectly. She also apologized to me publicly. She said, "I should have spoken up sooner. I knew something was wrong, and I stayed silent because I didn't want conflict. That was wrong. I'm sorry." That apology, that simple, honest apology from someone who'd realized their own complicity, hit the room harder than any accusation could have. It made the silence of everyone else feel like a choice. A deliberate choice to believe a lie. The narrative was cracking. In fact, it was completely shattering. Then Karen stood up. She told the room about a completely different situation with Keith. Different incident. Different year. Completely different context. Same manipulation. Same lies. Same pattern of twisting reality to make himself look better and someone else look worse. Another aunt nodded. And then a cousin shared their own story. A situation with Keith that had left them confused and hurt for years. They'd never understood why they'd believed his version until now. My brother's face went pale. The story wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. It was about a pattern of behavior that spanned decades. Keith stood up frantically and claimed misunderstandings. He said his memory was fuzzy, that he'd been under emotional stress, that he'd made innocent mistakes, that he wasn't intentionally lying. His voice changed completely. From confident to defensive. From smooth to desperate. Someone asked him a direct question about a specific detail he'd brought up earlier in his speech. He couldn't answer it. He fumbled. He changed the subject. The room watched him unravel in real time. My parents attempted to calm things down. To smooth it over. To make it all go away so the family reunion could continue. So they could go back to pretending they hadn't failed their daughter. But their earlier certainty now looked reckless. They realized silence had protected the wrong person. They realized they'd built their judgment on nothing but a lie. They looked at me like they were waiting. Waiting for me to help them. Waiting for me to minimize this. Waiting for me to fix the situation they'd created by choosing the wrong child to believe. I said nothing. I didn't give a speech. I didn't list all the ways I'd been wronged. I didn't defend myself further. I didn't cry or perform emotion. I just stood up and said, "I never lied." Nothing more. Nothing less. The restraint landed heavier than anger ever could have. It was the truth simply stated. And it was enough. Keith raised his voice. He contradicted himself repeatedly. He accused everyone of betrayal. He claimed they were all against him. He said they were ganging up on him. The room watched him spiral. They saw what I'd lived with for years. Panic. The desperation. The way he twisted reality when he felt threatened. The way he weaponized his emotions. The truth was undeniable now. Everyone could see it. Family conversations shifted overnight. The concern once aimed at me followed him now. Invitations stopped coming. For him. Relatives started being distant. Anxious. Like they were remembering all the times he'd manipulated them before this. Like they were finally seeing the pattern that had always been there. My parents asked to talk to me privately. We sat at a hotel coffee shop, away from the family. My parents looked older than I remembered them. "We were wrong," my mother said quietly. "We should have listened to you. We should have asked for your side before we took his word as gospel." My father didn't say much. He just nodded like he'd been carrying shame for a long time. I accepted the apology. Not with warmth. Not with coldness. Just acceptance. "I need to set a boundary," I told them. "I'm not rebuilding what we had. That relationship hurt me. It taught me that you wouldn't protect me. I need something different now. Something healthier." They didn't like it, but they accepted it. Some things can't be repaired. I didn't rebuild the old family dynamic. I didn't go back to Sunday dinners. I didn't pretend everything was fine and we could just move forward. I built a healthier distance instead. My brother avoided me completely now. He stopped coming to events if I was going to be there. He stopped talking about me in the family group chat. He stopped existing in my life. I never explained myself again. Not to him. Not to anyone who hadn't already shown they were willing to listen. The family tried to pull me back in to make things normal, but I kept the distance. I stayed kind but firm. I showed up when I wanted to. I didn't when I didn't. Silence didn't destroy me. It exposed him. And in the end, the truth was quieter and more powerful than any explanation I could have given. The family learned that my silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was strength. And it was the most honest thing I could have done.